I drove up to the remote campsite, a small gravel lot surrounded by thick woods. I picked this spot because it was isolated, and I was looking forward to a few quiet days. As I set up my tent, all I could hear was the rustling of leaves and the occasional bird call. The sky was clear, and the stars started to appear as night came. After eating dinner and lighting a small campfire, I went back to my car to read while the flames flickered outside. Hours passed, and the night grew colder. When I noticed the fire had died down to just embers, I decided to go outside and add more wood. The woods were eerily quiet, and I could barely see past the light of the fire. I threw on a few logs and watched as they caught fire, crackling in the dark. I went back to my car, feeling the chill as the temperature dropped. I started to doze off when I heard a noise outside. It was a faint rustling, like footsteps in the leaves. My heart raced as I looked out the window, but I saw nothing. The rustling stopped, and I tried to convince myself it was just an animal. Trying to shake off the uneasy feeling, I settled back into my seat. But the rustling started up again, louder and closer. It sounded like it was circling the car. I checked the surroundings again, but still, nothing was visible in the dark. Feeling nervous, I decided to get out and check. Grabbing a flashlight and a sturdy stick for protection, I stepped outside and shined the light into the darkness. All I could see were trees and underbrush. The rustling stopped as I was about to return to my car. That's when I noticed something strange. Large, muddy footprints were visible in the dirt near the campfire. They went right up to the edge of the light and then vanished. My heart pounded. The tracks were way too big for any animal I knew around here. I looked around the forest again, and then I saw it, a figure standing still between the trees, barely visible in the shadows. It wasn't moving, just watching me. I quickly ducked behind my car, my flashlight shaking in my hand. I could hear the figure moving slowly through the underbrush, getting closer to where I was hiding. I knew I had to leave right away. I scrambled back to my car, started the engine, and sped out of the campsite. The headlights briefly lit up the figure as I backed out. It was a man, dressed in dark clothes, blending into the shadows. I raced down the dirt road, gripping the wheel tightly. I didn't stop until I reached the nearest town. I pulled into a gas station, still trembling. I told the attendant what had happened, and he said he'd check on the campsite. The next day, I found out that the figure I saw was a local known for lurking in the woods. They had been reported missing a few days earlier, but no one knew where they were. I was glad to have escaped, but the memory of those footprints and the shadowy figure stayed with me. As I later learned, the figure was never found. The local police stopped searching after a few weeks, but rumors spread that the man had been using the woods as his hideout for years, watching campers and waiting for his next chance. The thought of him still out there, unseen and unknown, still sends shivers down my spine. Now, whenever I camp, I can't shake the feeling that someone might be watching me from the shadows, waiting for the right moment to make themselves known. I had been driving for what felt like forever. The city lights were long gone, replaced by a dark stretch of highway with the occasional glow of a distant farmhouse. My plan was simple: find a quiet spot to park the car, set up camp in the back seat, and get some sleep before continuing my trip in the morning. Finally, I spotted a dirt road branching off from the main highway. It seemed to lead into a forest, thick with trees and far from anyone else. It looked like the perfect place to rest. I turned onto the road, the tires crunching over gravel, and followed it deeper into the woods until my headlights found a small clearing. It seemed just right, secluded, quiet, and completely alone. I parked the car, turned off the engine, and everything went silent. The only sounds were the ticking of the cooling engine and the distant chirp of crickets. The air was cool, the kind that makes you shiver, but I didn't mind. I set up my sleeping bag in the back seat, cracked the windows just a bit for fresh air, and laid down, staring at the roof of the car. Sleep didn't come easy. I kept tossing and turning, listening to the noises outside. Every now and then, I heard rustling in the trees, probably just the wind or a small animal. I pulled the sleeping bag tighter around me, trying to ignore the uneasy feeling growing in my stomach. At some point, I finally dozed off. I don't know how long I slept, but when I woke up, it was pitch black outside. The moonlight barely broke through the thick trees, casting long, creepy shadows on the ground. Something had woken me up, but I couldn't figure out what. I stayed completely still, listening. Then I heard it again, a faint sound, like footsteps on gravel. But they weren't steady. They were off, like someone was trying to move quietly but wasn't very good at it. My heart started pounding. I told myself it was just an animal, maybe a deer or something. But it didn't feel right. The air felt heavier, more suffocating. I strained to hear, but the sound stopped. Minutes passed, maybe longer. I tried to calm down, but my mind wouldn't stop racing. Just when I began to think I had imagined it, I heard a new sound, this time, closer. A soft scraping against the side of the car, like something, or someone, was brushing up against it. My breath caught in my throat, and I froze. The sound moved along the side of the car, slow and deliberate. I couldn't see anything in the darkness, but I could feel it. Something was out there, right next to the car, moving around it. My heart pounded so hard I thought it might burst. I kept hoping it would just go away, but the scraping continued, moving around to the back of the car. Fear held me in place. Every instinct screamed at me to jump into the driver's seat, start the engine, and get the hell out of there, but I couldn't move. Then, the scraping stopped again. Silence. My eyes were wide open, staring into the darkness, waiting, listening. Suddenly, the back of the car dipped a little, like something had pushed down on the trunk. I gasped but couldn't make a sound. The car bounced back up as the weight lifted. Silence returned, but it was now terrifying. I knew I couldn't stay there another second. Finally, I forced myself to move. Slowly, I reached for the front seat, trying not to make any noise. I inched forward, every little sound feeling like it echoed through the night. Just as I was about to grab the steering wheel, the car rocked again, more violently this time. It felt like something or someone had jumped onto the roof. Panic took over. My shaking hands fumbled with the keys, desperately trying to start the engine. The car roared to life, and I slammed my foot on the gas, speeding out of the clearing and back onto the dirt road. I didn't look back, didn't slow down until I was back on the main highway. My hands were still shaking, my heart racing. As I drove, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something chasing me in the darkness. But there was nothing. The road was empty, and the trees on either side seemed to close in as I sped through the night. It wasn't until I was miles away, back on the highway with the first light of morning starting to show, that I finally allowed myself to breathe. I had no idea what was out there, but I knew one thing for sure: I would never camp in my car again. But even now, the fear hasn't gone away. Every time I think about that night, I can still hear that scraping sound, feel the car dip under that unseen weight. I'll never know what was out there, but I'm sure of one thing: it wasn't an animal. And whatever it wasn't just passing by. It was watching me, waiting for something. The thought that keeps me awake at night, long after that night in the woods, is that maybe, just maybe, it's still out there, waiting for the next person to stop. I parked my truck in a remote spot I had chosen for the night, far from any main roads or other campsites. The woods surrounded me, dark and quiet, with only the occasional rustle of leaves and distant owl hoots breaking the silence. I came out here to escape the city, looking for some peace and quiet. I set up my campfire and began cooking dinner, the flames flickering and casting eerie shadows on the trees. After eating, I put out the fire and crawled into my sleeping bag in the back of the truck. I usually sleep well while camping, but tonight, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. I thought it was just the darkness and unfamiliar surroundings, but the feeling wouldn't go away. Around midnight, I was jolted awake by a noise. It was a soft, rhythmic thumping, almost like someone was tapping a stick against a tree. I listened carefully, trying to figure out where it was coming from, but it seemed to come from all around. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it through the truck's windows but saw nothing unusual. Just as I was about to settle back down, I noticed something strange. The thumping had stopped, but now I could hear a faint dragging sound. It was getting closer, a scraping noise, like someone was pulling something heavy across the ground. My heart raced as I realized this wasn't just some animal. I tried to stay calm and turned off the flashlight, straining to hear. The dragging sound seemed to circle around the truck, getting louder and more frantic. I wondered if someone was trying to break into my truck, or if someone was out there trying to scare me, or worse. Suddenly, there was a loud crash, followed by a series of rapid, heavy footsteps. My pulse pounded in my ears. I held my breath, hoping whatever it was had gone away. The silence that followed was almost more terrifying than the noise. I couldn't see anything, but my imagination ran wild with frightening thoughts. After what felt like hours, the dragging sound started again, but this time it was moving away. I waited until it was completely gone before I dared to look outside. When I finally stepped out of the truck with my flashlight, I saw what had caused the noise. A large metal toolbox had been dragged from the edge of the woods and left on the ground, several feet from where it had originally been. I carefully checked the area but found no signs of anyone nearby. My guess was that someone, probably a hunter or camper, had left the toolbox behind, and the dragging noise was just a coincidence. But as I turned to head back to the truck, I noticed something chilling. The toolbox wasn't just dragged, it was placed deliberately in a pattern. The handles were pointing towards the woods, and there was something scratched into the dirt around it. I bent down to get a closer look, and the sight made my blood run cold. The scratches formed a crude symbol I recognized from survivalist forums, a warning sign used to mark danger. I had no idea who might have left that behind or what it meant, but it was clear that I was not alone out here. I hurriedly packed up my gear, my hands shaking as I threw everything into the truck. I left that spot as fast as I could, not stopping until I was back on a main road. As I drove away, I kept looking in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone following me. The forest was still and silent, but the image of that symbol stayed with me, a chilling reminder that the woods hold secrets best left undisturbed. I wanted some time alone, so I decided to take my SUV out for a weekend of car camping in a spot I'd found online. It was deep in a national forest, far away from the usual campsites, which meant fewer people and more quiet. The drive was long, and the road eventually turned into a narrow dirt path, with thick trees on both sides. The farther I drove, the more alone I felt. By late afternoon, I found a small open area near a creek, a good place to set up camp. The air was cool, and the sound of the flowing water was soothing. I parked my SUV with the back facing the woods and the front toward the open space, just in case I needed to leave in a hurry. I made a sleeping area in the back of the car, leaving the tailgate open so I could enjoy the view of the trees. After a simple dinner, I settled in with a book. The sun dipped below the horizon, and soon it was just me, the soft sound of leaves rustling, and the trickle of the creek. As night came, the woods around me got darker than I had expected. I only had a small lantern to light up my little area. The trees seemed to press in closer, their shadows growing longer and darker. But I wasn't too worried. I'd camped alone many times before. It wasn't until I heard the first crunch of leaves behind my car that I started to feel uneasy. It wasn't an accident. It was like someone, or something, was walking slowly through the forest. I turned off my lantern to listen more closely. My eyes adjusted to the dark, and I looked at the line of trees, but I couldn't see anything. I told myself it was just an animal. It had to be. But the sound didn't stop. Every few minutes, there was another crunch, then silence, then another. Whatever it was, it seemed to be circling my camp. I grabbed my flashlight and pointed it into the trees. The light cut through the darkness, but there was nothing there, just thick woods. I moved the light back and forth, trying to see any movement, but everything was still. I crawled back into the car and shut the tailgate, feeling a little safer. The thought of leaving crossed my mind, but I'd driven for hours to get here, and I wasn't going to leave because of a few noises. I locked the doors, laid back down, and tried to sleep, though my ears stayed tuned to every little sound outside. I must have fallen asleep at some point because I woke up suddenly to a loud bang against the side of the car. My heart raced as I sat up, wide awake. The noise had come from the passenger side, but the windows were tinted, so I couldn't see clearly outside. The air felt thick, heavy with something I couldn't name. I held my breath, waiting to hear the sound again. Then, there was a slow, scraping sound along the side of the car, like something, or someone, was dragging a stick or a branch across the metal. I couldn't explain it, but it felt like I was being watched, like whoever or whatever was out there wanted me to know they were close, very close. My chest tightened with fear, but I forced myself to stay calm. I had to think straight. I grabbed my car keys, ready to start the engine and get out of there, but then the scraping stopped. Everything went quiet again, too quiet. My hand hovered over the ignition, unsure of what to do. If I left now, I'd be driving down that narrow dirt road in total darkness, with no cell service and no idea what, or who, was out there. I stayed frozen, listening for any sign of movement, but there was only silence. I waited like that for what felt like hours until the first light of dawn started creeping through the trees. I finally let out a breath I didn't realize I was holding. With daylight came a small sense of safety, but I knew better than to relax. I waited a little longer, making sure the sun was fully up before I finally unlocked the doors and stepped out. I walked around the car, my legs shaky, and found the source of the noise. There were long, deep scratches down the side of the SUV, too clean and straight to have been made by a branch or an animal. Whatever had been out there had left its mark, a clear message that I wasn't welcome. I didn't waste any more time. I packed up my things as quickly as I could and got back in the car. As I drove away, my eyes kept darting to the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something, or someone, following me. But the road stayed empty, the trees still and silent. The scratches on my car are the only proof that something, or someone, was out there with me that night. As I drove back home, I tried to shake off the feeling of being watched, but it lingered, clinging to me like the cold morning fog. I couldn't help but feel that whatever had been out there wasn't done with me yet. Maybe I escaped that night, but something tells me that it'll find me again, one day when I'm least expecting it. And next time, I'm not sure I'll be as lucky. I had been driving for hours, wanting to get away from the busy city and find some quiet. Car camping seemed like the perfect idea, a night under the stars, surrounded by nature. I found a spot off a dirt road, far from the highway where I couldn't hear any cars passing by. It was isolated, just the way I liked it. There were no other cars, no signs of people, just me and my old truck parked near a bunch of tall pine trees. The evening was calm, but the quiet felt heavy, almost too much. I could hear the wind blowing through the trees and the occasional cricket chirping, but other than that, it was silent. Setting up my camp was easy. I just leaned back the seat in my truck, unrolled my sleeping bag, and got ready to sleep. As the sun went down, the woods got darker, and the air grew colder. I wasn't too worried, though. My truck was strong, and I felt safe inside it. I ate a quick dinner, read a few pages of a book by the light of my flashlight, then decided it was time to sleep. Lying there in the dark, I started to notice how loud the quiet had become. Every little sound seemed bigger, the creaking of the trees, the rustling of the leaves. It felt like something was out there, just beyond where my headlights could reach. I tried to tell myself it was just my nerves, that I was imagining things. But then I heard it, a clear sound that wasn't the wind or the trees. It was a slow, steady crunching, like someone stepping on dry leaves. My heart started racing as I listened closely, hoping it was just a deer or some other animal. But the sound got closer, the footsteps becoming clearer and heavier, like a person's. I didn't want to move. I didn't want to make a sound. I just lay there, frozen, staring up at the dark ceiling of my truck. The footsteps stopped right next to the driver's side door. I could barely breathe, terrified that whoever, or whatever, was out there could hear me. For what felt like forever, nothing happened. Then, suddenly, the truck shook a little, like someone was trying to open the door. I had locked it, of course, but the fact that someone was out there, trying to get in, sent a wave of fear through me. The door handle rattled a few more times, then went quiet. I stayed still, listening, trying to figure out if they had gone away. But instead of leaving, I heard a low, rough breathing, like someone was leaning against the door, just inches away from me. I could feel my heart pounding in my throat, every muscle in my body tight with fear. Then, as quickly as it started, the breathing stopped. The footsteps began again, but this time they were moving away, back into the woods. I didn't move for a long time, too scared to even look outside. Eventually, I got up the nerve to peek through the window, but there was nothing, just darkness and the faint outline of the trees. I didn't sleep at all that night. I just sat there, gripping the steering wheel, my eyes darting around, searching the dark for any sign of movement. As soon as the first light of morning broke through the trees, I started the engine and sped off as fast as I could. I didn't look back, not once. I don't know who, or what, was out there that night, but I can still hear those footsteps, that heavy breathing. They stay with me, in the back of my mind, every time I think about camping. I haven't gone car camping since, and I doubt I ever will again. I thought I had escaped the city to find peace, but what I found out there in the woods was something I can't explain, something that felt too real to ignore. And now, whenever I drive down a quiet road or park my truck in a dark spot, I can't shake the feeling that someone is watching, waiting for the right moment to come back. Maybe next time, I won't be so lucky. I decided to spend a weekend camping in the forest to escape the busy city. The first day went well. I set up my tent, gathered firewood, and enjoyed the peace and quiet of nature. By nightfall, the crackling fire and the distant hooting of owls made me feel relaxed. The next morning, I woke up early and went for a hike. The trail was beautiful, with sunlight shining through the trees and birds singing. But as the day went on, dark clouds started to gather. I decided to head back to camp to avoid getting caught in the rain. By the time I got back, it had started to drizzle. I quickly gathered my things and put them inside the tent. The rain soon turned into a heavy downpour. I huddled inside, listening to the heavy drops hitting the tent. It was then that I noticed a strange sound, a rustling, too close to my tent to be just the wind or rain. I tried to ignore it, thinking it was just my nerves. But the rustling grew louder and more constant. I peeked out of the tent's flap and saw nothing but dark shapes and shadows. My mind raced, thinking of wild animals or, worse, a person lurking out there. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it outside, moving the beam across the campsite. Nothing. Just trees and the endless rain. But the sound continued, now seeming to move around me. My heart pounded as I realized it was no longer just rustling. It was the sound of someone, or something, moving through the bushes. I decided to get out of the tent and check it out. I walked carefully, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the rain. My footsteps were almost silent on the wet ground. Suddenly, I saw a figure crouching near my food supply. It was a man, drenched, trying to steal my food. He looked just as scared as I was when our eyes met. He stumbled back, mumbling something I couldn't hear over the rain. My heart was racing, but I tried to stay calm. Seeing he wasn't a threat, and was probably just as desperate as I was, I signaled for him to come closer. We both took shelter under a nearby tree, where the rain wasn't as heavy. I gave him some food and water, and we sat there in silence, listening to the rain. Eventually, the rain stopped, and the man, after thanking me, disappeared back into the forest. I never found out who he was or why he was out there, but I was glad the encounter ended peacefully. I packed up my things the next morning and left the campsite, feeling a strange mix of fear and relief. As I walked back to my car, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The trees seemed to close in around me, and every rustle of leaves made me jump. When I finally reached the car, I breathed a sigh of relief and drove away, promising myself I wouldn't camp alone again. Weeks later, I read a news report about a missing person last seen in the same forest. The description matched the man I had seen. They never found him. Now, every time I close my eyes, I see his face, and I wonder if he ever really left the forest, or if something else found him first. I had just finished setting up my camp for the night, and my old pickup truck was softly humming as it cooled down. It was one of those rare weekends when I had the whole place to myself. The campsite was remote, tucked away in the middle of the woods. The sun had just gone down, and the trees cast long shadows. The only light came from my campfire, which flickered and created creepy shapes against the darkness of the forest. I was enjoying the peace, roasting marshmallows and listening to the fire crackle. It was a nice break from the usual noise of daily life. I had just finished eating when I heard a soft rustling in the bushes near my tent. I told myself it was probably a deer or some other animal, nothing to worry about. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The rustling kept happening. Sometimes it sounded like something heavier, like a person moving through the bushes. I was used to camping alone, but this felt different. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it towards the noise. The beam cut through the dark but showed nothing unusual. My heart raced as I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination. I went back to the campfire, forcing myself to stay calm. I checked around the campsite but didn't see anything out of place. The night got colder, and the rustling stopped. I felt a little better, thinking maybe I had just been too nervous. I decided to go to bed and crawled into my sleeping bag in the truck's cab, leaving the tailgate down for fresh air. I must have dozed off, but I was suddenly jolted awake by a loud crash outside. My heart pounded as I scrambled up, gripping the flashlight tightly. I looked out through the truck's window and saw a shadow moving quickly among the trees. It wasn't an animal. It was too big and deliberate. I was frozen with fear but managed to grab my phone and call the police. While I waited, every sound in the forest seemed louder. The silence after the crash was unnerving. I watched the shadow from the window, trying to make out any details. When I called the police, they assured me they were on their way. Minutes felt like hours. Finally, I saw the flashing lights of a police car cutting through the trees. 2 officers got out and walked towards my truck. I barely managed to tell them about the crash and the shadowy figure. The officers checked the area around my campsite and found that someone had tried to break into my truck. They discovered footprints leading away from the campsite, going deeper into the woods. It was clear that someone had been watching me and had gotten scared when I woke up. After the police left, I packed up my things and drove home. When I finally reached my house, the relief was intense. But as I looked back at the dark, empty forest, a chilling thought crossed my mind. What if the person who was watching me was still out there? What if they had followed me back, waiting for another chance? I couldn't shake the feeling of eyes watching me from the shadows. Every noise, every creak of the house seemed like a reminder that the forest had something far more sinister lurking in the darkness.